Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Have We Got Planning News for You? Or should that, in light of the Prime Minister's speech this week, be Have We Got Planning News for You? Thank you all for joining us again. We've got another packed show for you today, including our special discussion topic on what the Prime Minister's speech on planning and infrastructure on Tuesday means for the future of the planning system, in England at least. And who better to have as our special guest when we're talking about such important issues than Victoria Hills, the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. Victoria, welcome. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. As always, please do continue to provide questions or comments in the Q&A function, and we hugely welcome that as always. We'll follow up any points you like on our LinkedIn page afterwards. Can I give you the usual reminder to consider making a donation to our NHS COVID-19 appeal just viewing page or charity of your choice. And now, without further ado, let me introduce the panel. And I should say that following the PM's bashing of the planning system for being obsessed with newt counting, our special theme this week is protected species. I'm assuming Sasha, after his haircut, is going to go as the badger. Can I ask you in turn, say who you are, where you are, what you're drinking, and what your species is? Mary.
Good evening. Good evening from Wandsworth. I am drinking one of my favourite gins after one of my favourite cities, Plymouth, where I spent many a happy time, often against Sasha. And in tribute to our special theme, I'm not sure you can see, maybe you can, I'm going to get up and give you a little show. And also I'd like to introduce my friend Percy the penguin.
Fantastic, Mary. Chris.
No, Charlie, I don't think we've got Chris.
We've not got Chris. Well,
I think Mary's pretending to be Mary and Chris.
Yes.
Mary's in the scheme of hybrid inquiries, Mary is doing a real hybrid appearance on Have We Got Planning News for You by being Chris and herself simultaneously. I am Sasha White, and I'm going to... Sorry, Paul, I'll just jump in as I was talking. I'll just say... I'm Sasha White, I'm in London, and I thought in the light of the zoning proposals, I'm wearing a sweatshirt which shows everyone where I'm going when the planning system is abolished.
Can I say, I'm Paul Tucker from King's Chambers, and now that he's on, I can say I've tried being Chris Young Mary, didn't like it. You might want to think again, but it's a delight to see him back on.
Can we also, before we hear from Chris, can we tell Chris, Chris, can you hear us? If so, give us a thumbs up. Chris, can you look down? Your camera is down, straight ahead, you're now, there we are. That is it.
Number 5 in their fancy marketing suite, and they can't get the camera to point at Chris's face. How are you, Chris?
Can I just dive in and finish off in terms of my protected species, because I've stolen it from the lounge. I have a lapwing there. That's my protected species. I thought about a rhino, straight from Africa, as well as thinking about England rugby. But nonetheless, I've gone for the lapwing.
Chris.
Hello.
Welcome.
My name's Chris Young. I'm drinking, and I'm going to drink a lot in the next hour after the IT pleasure that I've just enjoyed. I'm drinking High Hopes, which is, I've just finished an inquiry, and I think it's gone quite well. And as far as being an endangered species, well, I don't know if they're endangered, but obviously I've got to be an owl.
Of course. What else? Well, I'm drinking today something which my very good friend John Bower of WBD sent in. This special edition Barnard Castle ITES Brewdog beer. I'd like to dedicate this drink to my friends amongst you who are watching who are in Leicester, which of course is facing an additional lockdown. Just so that you know, Barnard Castle is a mere 3 hours drive from Leicester, but maybe take a spin to Loughborough first just to check your eyesight. For my contribution to the protected species thing, I've got this very beautiful book on sharks, one of my favourite animals, by Michelle Muller for Taschen. Rumour has it she's currently working on a sequel called Lawyers. Now, I've already mentioned that we are honoured to have with us today Victoria. Victoria, tell us, where are you, what are you drinking, and what's your species of the day?
Well, I'm currently, thank you so much for having me, by the way. I'm currently in an undisclosed location in Essex, and I'm joined by, well, he's a little bit shy, but this is Nathaniel, and it's my newt. There we go. So he just wants to say hello, and I'll just pop him up there a moment. He's just going to sit there because the reason I'm a little bit dressed up is the party started earlier. It's my birthday tomorrow, so I'll be drinking this because it's my favourite drink, and I might need it after this. So thank you.
I hope you've got a licence for that, new Victoria.
That might be, if Boris has his way, that might be the last remaining newt in the UK in about 5 years.
No, Nathaniel says no. Sorry, you're wrong on that one. Sorry.
Now, as usual, our guest interview this week with Victoria is going to be in the second half of the show. But before then, Victoria, please do comment on anything else you'd like. And I'm sure you'll have lots to say on the discussion topic on the planning-related news from Westminster. Before we get there, however, court case of the week, our traditional first slot. I'm going to introduce this. It's another Oxton Farm case, Oxton Farms and Harrogate Council, judgment of the Court of Appeal issued about a week ago. This was a challenge to a planning permission granted by Harrogate Borough Council for relatively modest development, 20 new homes in a village shop on an unallocated site in the village of Bickerton. It was granted by the Harrogate Planning Committee in accordance with the advice of the council's case officer. And her report in particular said that the council could only demonstrate a 5.02 year housing land supply, of course 5-year supply being the critical cut-off for the automatic application of tilted balance. And she said this is not sufficiently above the 5-year supply that paragraph 11 of the MPPF can be ignored. And there are lots of grounds of challenge, but the main one alleged that the council had applied the tilted balance for housing land supply reasons, despite having a, albeit fractionally, greater than 5-year supply. And Lord Justice Lewison rejected that, but in a judgment that was quite far-ranging on the application of the tilted balance for housing supply and other grounds. Definitely worth a read if you haven't done so already. And what he started by doing is reiterating that the tilted balance is only engaged on housing supply grounds if there is a less than 5-year supply. He said either there is a 5-year housing land supply or there isn't. If there is, then the tilted balance is, if there is a 5-year supply, the tilted balance is not engaged on that basis. It doesn't matter whether the supply exceeds 5 years by a little or a lot. And then he went on to say, and I think this is probably the most important, relevant statement of principle for future cases. He emphasised that, as a number of us argued successfully in the past, 5-year supply shortfall isn't the only way you can get into the tilted balance by virtue of the development plan being out of date, even under the new framework. And he says the policy may be out of date because of a change in national policy or because of things that have happened on the ground or for some other reason. So the gateway to the tilted balance on the plan being out of date is not confined, so the Court of Appeal has held conclusively onto the 5-year supply test. And indeed, it was this gateway that Lord Justice Lewison held was, on proper analysis, the basis on which the council applied the tilted balance in this case. So although that comment about you can't ignore the tilted balance of housing supply reasons because it's 5.02, he thought there were two freestanding grounds on which the council had correctly applied the tilted balance, or legally applied it. Firstly, in order to maintain the supply of housing land, greenfield sites were needed, and that meant settlement boundaries in the local plan were out of date. That's the argument which I sometimes characterise as there's a 5-year supply, but despite the local plan, not because of it. And in that situation, the local plan is out of date, even if there is a 5-year supply, because it's not doing the job it's meant to do. And Lord Justice Lewison endorsed that argument. And he also went on to hold there's a further freestanding basis for holding that the most important policies were out of date, namely that the housing policies were based upon an out-of-date housing target. And that was itself a freestanding basis for applying the tilted balance. So some quite useful stuff there, in my view, for house builders and promoters of housing development in future cases, albeit bearing in mind that Lord Justice Lewison was looking at it through the prism of was the council's planning judgment irrational. He also rejected the allegation that it was wrong in law for the council not to have reduced the housing requirement figure it was using for the purpose of housing and supply once the Office of National Statistics 2016 stats were published. He felt the council was entitled in its planning judgment to continue to apply higher targets than those which would have been the consequence of standard methodology. But I strike a note of caution. If you look at the chronology of this case, the decision was August 2018. So if before the amendments to the PPG, they made clear that in the decision-making context, you can't depart from the standard method. So I'm not sure that part of the judgment necessarily applies going forward. Anyway, that's my take on it. Paul, you've got some thoughts on this case, haven't you?
Yeah, just one really. But before I do, I've got two links to this case, which I'm quite proud of. One of which is that, firstly, my pupil, former pupil, now the eminent John Hunter, was in this case and won, having lost in the Gill case. That's the one with the vases that we did a couple of weeks ago in the Supreme Court. So delightful that John had a winner on that one. And secondly, I drove past this village 2 days ago whilst moving my my middle son's stuff from university. He was moving 250 yards around the corner, and yet I had to drive it all over to Lancashire to stay overnight to drive back again. So I've driven past this village in the last 2 days due to my son's abilities as a logistics manager. In terms of what the case tells you, my view is that this is a case which answers a question which I thought had been definitively answered by Lord Carnwath in the Hopkins Holmes case in the Supreme Court, which is settlement boundaries can be out of date by virtue of their geographical extent being based upon out-of-date housing supplies, and that can be a route to the tilted balance irrespective of 5-year land supply. It's obvious. I don't know why the contrary ever gets argued. So, but it's sufficiently blindingly obvious that no doubt I'll be arguing it in Cheshire next time I have a 5-year land supply case there.
Thanks, Paul. Well, lots of comments today. Quite a few people wondering how Chris is managing that far away from the camera, given that photograph of you right up in front of the camera. Lots of comments on your hair as well, Chris. You look like an extra from Back to the Future. Of course, we can have haircuts next week. I booked mine in on Tuesday. I did say to my hairdresser, I think we might need a double slot. But I gather, Chris, you're pushing on through.
Yeah. I'm just gonna go and grow it until I get a man bun.
Like Jon Snow.
Yeah. Can I just comment, Paul? Absolutely right. Paragraph 63. It's etched in my brain of the Suffolk Coastal and Richborough case. Although there's been a debate about that in the Peel case that was in the Court of Appeal this week with Rupert and JCB. So the whole thing continues to be argued, but the point is it's up to the decision maker, Mr. Boyland, who I notice has joined us. Mr. Boyland did the right thing. He reduced the weights that he gave a policy based on an out-of-date housing requirement. As you say, Paul, couldn't be more obvious, could it?
No. Goes back to the City of Edinburgh, actually, well before all of our times. Now, we must move on. PINS and MHCLG decision of the week. Mary, you're going to introduce the Notting Hill Gate case,
yes.
Close to home for us Londoners.
Yes. So this is a case all about an office block called Newcomb House that was once described by Simon Jenkins as a squalid 1960s block, which would do a discredit to a Soviet suburb.
Wow. I know a few of those as well, as it happens.
Yeah, yeah. So this was the second time that this Newcomb House had been before an inspector. In June 2017, an appeal had been dismissed for a broadly similar scheme that was in front of Christina Downs, you gentlemen will be glad to know. And that earlier scheme had been rejected because that inspector was concerned about the loss of social housing and the fact that there was no provision for any affordable housing on the scheme in front of him. And he was not satisfied with the viability case that was in front of him and thought that a more realistic assessment of existing use values could have produced a scheme with some affordable housing. So this was the second application that was made several months later in September 2017. That application was taken over by the mayor, and the mayor and the developer came to an agreement, And but for a holding direction issued by Brokenshire, the then Secretary of State, the mayor would have issued permission. So it's got an interesting background. And this time round, the scheme was promoting 55 residential units, 23 of which were affordable, as well as office, a new surgery, a new public square. And at the heart of this was an issue. So on one side, we had the developer and the mayor, and on the other, we had RBKC. And there was a tall building being promoted, which the inspector thought would be visually engaging, slender and elegant. And quite apart from her perfect exercise of balancing heritage considerations, she had 2 conservation areas where she said there would be no harm. She identified 3 conservation areas where she said there would be less than substantial harm. And this was not a case where the tilted balance was engaged. RBKC had a 5-year housing land supply. No policies were out of date. But nevertheless, she attached very significant weight to the provision of the affordable housing. She attached very significant weight to the £7 million contribution that was made to achieve step-free access at the local tube station. The new public square and the new medical centre also attracted very significant weight. The Secretary of State agreed with her weighting exercise, and so in the end she was clear that planning permission should be granted. Of particular interest here is the affordable housing issue and the fact that there were 2 106 obligations. The first obligation had what was described as a blue pencil clause in it, and indeed several of the clauses in that 106 agreement were regarded as non-SIL compliant and were disregarded by the inspector, including, for example, car-free permits. The more interesting one was the supplemental agreement. The supplemental agreement introduced a mechanism which was an attempt to avoid a traditional late stage review mechanism. And in this particular supplementary agreement, the applicant could choose to buy residential dwellings in RBKC, deliver and refurbish those as affordable, and put that towards a late stage mechanism if one was triggered. The other thing that the supplemental did was make provision for off-site affordable housing to be provided in Hillingdon, and for that, for those properties which were going to be market properties which would be acquired, turned into affordable housing, RBKC would have enjoyed nomination rights. Now, the Secretary of State disregarded both of those provisions, coming to the conclusion that neither of them were SIL regulation compliant. The inspector took a slightly different view. Although she concluded that the off-site nomination rights were not SIL regulation compliant, she nevertheless attached some weight to them. So it's an interesting example. And the other thing I just want to mention, which Chris is going to explain, is because the supplemental agreement was largely an agreement negotiated with the mayor and the developer, and naturally the developer was slightly anxious that perhaps the Secretary of State wasn't going to agree with that. They asked the Secretary of State to consider, if it were required, issuing a minded to grant letter. And at that point, I pause and hand over to Chris.
Yes, that was you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mary. I have to say, there's nothing better than when you've just done a 2-week inquiry and you've been up all night writing your closing submissions, and it's an hour before your webinar, but you just have a quick look at a 524 paragraph report. So luckily Mary has largely covered the material. Thank you very much. I'm just going to, she very kindly indicated I could talk about minded to grant. And I've been here before with the University of Reading, where the Secretary of State didn't like the university's argument about not paying £1 million by way of SAM, or as we called it, pay it again SAM, on top of providing SANG, if you know what all those acronyms stand for. And but rather than refuse after a 5-year process, the Secretary of State issued a minded to grant, which was effectively to say, pay the £1 million for the SAM contribution and you can have your ticket. You don't have to go back to square one. So it's a very clever device to make sure that you don't lose everything by putting all your eggs in one basket. And that's what Christina Downs said here at paragraph 465. If the Secretary of State didn't want to follow her approach, which was to say it's not still compliant, but I'm treating it as a material consideration, and wanted to take another approach, then a minded to grant could be issued. But the Secretary of State was clear. He didn't think any of that was necessary. He didn't think it was still compliant, didn't take it into account, but it is still part of the obligation. I had a quick chat with John Rhodes, who's the planning consultant, about 30 minutes ago, and he said this is a very difficult scheme in terms of putting it together. The viability is not generous to the developer, and to make it work, this is the approach they've taken. And clearly, I think the inspector was impressed with the approach. It appears to be flexible, and it touches on an issue, doesn't it, about providing affordable housing in London outside of the most expensive boroughs, which is obviously, something of an interesting issue.
Yeah.
And the quirk, Chris, about the minded to grant process is, of course, traditionally it's been something the Secretary of State has been relatively prepared to use for pretty much the duration of my whole career. Inspectors, despite the fact they have pretty much the same powers as the Secretary of State in cases which are delegated to them, tend not to be prepared to exercise, with one or two notable exceptions. I know John Gray did was a big one in Cambridge, the Kit Kat did, where John Gray issued a minded to letter, and I think Christina Downs actually has done one. I think actually one I've done in front of her. But it seems to be something inspectors are much more reluctant to do. To some extent, it's been overtaken by events by the standard 106 form, which basically offers everything conditional on the inspector saying it's necessary.
It's also the case that we see a lot less of them. They're few and far between. So for young practitioners, actually, they may never have come across them.
No, that's very true. Very true, Mary.
Now, we need to move from the PIN's decision of the week to Westminster, and who better to introduce the PM's agenda than Paul Tucker. Paul, tell us what Boris has been up to this week.
Well, can I just say I've worn a rugby shirt, but I've been given a hospital pass on this one. I have precisely 5 minutes to tell you what's been going on this week. And as those who've looked at the planning press will know, there's been barely anything. It's been a dead quiet week. It's hardly been in the news. So here goes. Deep breath, pens at the ready. This is what's been going on. Firstly, the Business and Planning Bill, now past its second reading in the House of Commons, on its way to the House of Lords. Clauses 17 to 19 extend some planning permissions and listed building consents that would lapse between the 23rd of March and the 31st of December, and they're extended until the 1st of April 2021 if you make application 28 days after the Act comes into force. Breathe. Planning permissions which have lapsed before provisions are in force will be subject to new environmental approvals within 28 days. That is, if you've lapsed before the Act comes into force, then you've got an environmental permitting scheme. Recall what Charlie had to say in Hong Kong? It's real, folks. We've got it in a slightly bonkers form in relation to the extension of planning permissions. EIAs by default. I should note, Section 73 hasn't been amended, though, has it? Next, power to amend Section 319A of the Township Planning Act. They expect us to have a hybrid written reps, hearing, stroke inquiry type appeal, slightly backlinks to which set of regs should be used, but there we are. No doubt we'll have secondary legislation, but we're going to have another hybrid form of appeal. Next, there's going to be temporary measures to fast track construction work and relax conditions. Next, there's going to be other measures such as pavement permits, relaxing licensing control, no requirement for hard copies of the London Plan, etc. Next, the Prime Minister announced that the most radical change to the planning system since 1945 Can I just pause there? The Town and Country Planning Act, Mr. Johnson, was introduced in 1947. In 1945, I had checked the legislation. There was only one planning act introduced in 1945. It was the Welsh Church Burial Grounds Act to prevent discrimination against non-members of the Church of Wales being buried in Church of Wales burial grounds. That's the only planning act in 1945. If this is your biggest change since then, it's not impressive. I thought apparently there's going to be a bold and creative planning white paper that's going to be published soon, according to Chris Pincher, or next month, according to Boris, or autumn, according to what's in the press today. Just what the UK economy needs: less certainty.
Yes.
We're going to have a promise of an eradication of newt counting delay. I like newts. I like Victoria's newt. Victoria's newt is an excellent newt, and I will count it as many times during the course of the next half an hour as I possibly can. We have no clear idea as to whether we're going to get a zoning system. Apparently, at last week's National Planning Summit, Chris Pincher said there were no firm proposals, God love him, or indeed further tweaking of our existing system. But it doesn't sound like an especially green, environmentally friendly agenda. Breathe. We're also going to get a new deal for the UK building industry with about a tenth of the proportionate investment that Roosevelt did in the 1930s. We're going to get an extension, a change of use. Is anybody keeping up with this, by the way, just out of interest? Changes of use.
Daniel, he's got it all down.
Excellent. If you record this, you can play it back at half speed and it'll make sense. We're going to get changes to the PD rights to allow most types of commercial buildings, which is going to be another new definition in the GDPO, to convert to C3, but not pubs, not libraries. A1 will be able to convert to cafes and offices. There'll be no need for a planning application if a landowner of a commercial building wants to demolish and rebuild vacant and redundant buildings. Flats are going to be able to be increased by a couple of stories in height if they're no more than 3 stories in height, 3 stories in height and less than 30 metres high, and they're going to be subject to a prior approval thing. At long last, government is going to require you to put windows in when you're doing a change of use in relation to PD. How that wasn't obvious is beyond me. And also, thank God, there's going to be temporary permitted development rights to allow the holding of a market or a trial of speed, just like the last 5 minutes of your life. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Chris, before we come to you, I mean, one thing that it was reported in some corners is all these kind of bit piece measures, that they were the great big planning reforms, the biggest ones ever since the Second World War. My reading of it was this is what's going to hold the ring until something even more radical, so the government sees it, i.e. zoning or something along the lines of what we were talking about last week. That zoning is still very much on the table. Is that your take on it? And what are your thoughts generally on the reforms?
Well, I think the thing about Mr. Pincher is he's probably become a little bit nervous about letting the cat out the bag, I would have thought. A bit too early. So he's just playing it cool for now. Yeah, there is a lot going on. It's more chaotic, frankly, than my hair. And the reality is it's quite bitty, these bits and pieces. This isn't the big reform that's coming, if it's coming. Of course, every minister and every prime minister talks about how they're going to carry out great reforms. So I read Robert Jenrick's letter from the 30th of June. And it's quite interesting. You can see where the minister is speaking, and then you can see where Simon Gallagher's speaking. So we're going to do all these things, complete freedom in town centres, use class orders. There's going to be one use class order for everything. And then the Simon Gallagher bit, or other civil servants are available. I recognise that there are certain uses which give rise to important local considerations, for example, to ensure local pubs and theatres are protected, i.e. not turned into kebab shops. And there's a lot of recognition that actually there needs to be some safeguards here. So there's a lot more thinking to be done. They just want to say something positive. I think, you know, that's to be encouraged. I think the really big reform that Boris wants to have is going to be later on. But I think we are going to have something. I did notice, I happened to be advising a client on some tall flats with our good friend, Mr. Ritchie, friend of the show. And we noticed that you can go up 2 stories. That's coming in without too much doubt, I think. So if you've got freestanding flats, you can go up 2-story, which helps us because we want to put something else next door and go higher than we've already got. So a lot going on. Well done, Paul. I don't know how you managed that.
Can I just say on the 2 stories, Chris, that's coming in as of the 1st of August. There's some changes to the GDPR which are definitely in the draft regs. Can I just take a breath and say a little bit more slowly? There is one dead easy reform for the Secretary of State to bring in, and would be a radical change to the planning system, because it would make it make sense again. The fundamentals are not that complicated. Let's go back to PPG 1, which says we have a presumption in favour of development unless there is demonstrable harm to interests of acknowledged importance. It's the mantra I was brought up on, and it makes sense because it's the fundamentals of the 1947 Act. Dead easy, Secretary of State. Please just have a read of what's happened in the past. Thanks, Jolly.
Brilliant. Well, I'm tempted to ask Victoria now what we think, but I think this is probably a good segue into our interview, Victoria, because I know some of the questions that Sasha is going to lead on this touch on this. So, Sasha, if I hand over to you, and we'll take it from there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try and get rid of my misty-eyed nature, because Newcombe House was within 500 yards of where I was born and brought up. So I'm a London boy, hence the Taylor Swift song at the beginning. Anyway, I won't miss it, that's for sure. Victoria, lovely to have you on. And as has been mentioned, it's a real pleasure, particularly of this week. And we like your championing the power of planning. First of all, can you just tell us, just for our audience, who are many of your members, just describe what's the current membership now of the RTPI?
Well, thank you very much. And those who aren't members, of course, the door is always very firmly open. So Royal Town Planning Institute, we're now up to about 25,500 members. In fact, we've never been bigger. We grew last year. It's my intention we continue to grow. We know the size of the market in the UK. I've got about 25% of the market share to go yet, and we will go for it, pandemic or not. So yes, we're in good shape, actually, very good shape.
And as a result of your day-to-day role, what do you say? Obviously, planning's never been more topical. When I started in '91, it was a kind of a niche kind of area in a sense, or the perception was. Now we seem to be on the front page of the paper every day. What is your view? What is your view about the planning system currently, based on the feedback from your membership?
Well, I think we try and take a bit more of a global view as well, of course, because a lot of members abroad as well. And I'm speaking quite regularly now, more regularly than I've ever done, actually, to my global counterparts around the world. And I know it may be hard for some people listening in this to believe it, but they actually hold our planning system up on a bit of a pedestal, really. The UK is seen as gold standard around the rest of the world in terms of our planning system. And so, you know, I think where we've got to is, despite significant sort of cuts to the planning system over the last 10 years, 40% local authority budget's gone out of the planning system, despite off the back of the last economic downturn. We feel there's an awful lot of fake news, quite frankly, floating around at the moment about planning. And we're pretty sort of fed up with it, really. We want to set the record straight. We think our planning system is a very strong asset to the UK. And we are going to be very much in the business of myth busting. Within the last hour, we've just published an open letter. It's gone into number 10, and everybody else, really trying to start to set that record straight, that we have a great planning system. Just think about what we've achieved against that backdrop of 40% cuts. Think about what we could achieve if everybody got behind it and helped us to resource it better. And I should just say, this isn't a local authority viewpoint solely. It doesn't matter whether I speak to landowners, developers, you name it. Everybody wants to get behind it and to make it work. So my view currently is we have the most successful planning system in the world. We're very good at beating ourselves up about it and saying it's not. We need to stop talking it down. We need to start talking it up. We need to start rebutting the fake news. We have started that in our campaign this week, a plan for the world that we need. And we're just about to start cranking the handle on that, actually, because I think many people, not just planners, but many people out in the community have had enough of some of this fake news that's been circulating around over the last few weeks. So how's that for a starter for 10?
Very good.
Can we countersign the letter, Victoria, please?
I'm sorry, it's signed and it's gone. It's in my name, so I may just have, I may just have doomed my entire career, but it's gone out in my name. So there you go.
And can I ask, before we come on to talk about the future, you've obviously talked about the letter and your perspective. Can you reassure, give a sense to our audience, what's your feel for the traction that the RTPI actually has? I mean, have you got people in government and those advising the government listening to what the RTPI are saying?
Well, I can say with a genuine level of authenticity that compared to the organisation that I stepped into 2 years ago, that we are now much closer to the position we want to in terms of influencing government. And I can give you evidence of that. Just in the House of Commons this week, the Business Secretary personally quoted the Royal Town Planning Institute as being in support of some of those flexible arrangements that you've mentioned there in the bill earlier in the week. And it's been a little while since we've been mentioned in that way. If you judge success by meetings, then certainly, yes, I was speaking to Minister Pincher last Friday. I've spoken to more MPs and advisors and civil servants in the last 4 months compared to the last probably 4 years, or certainly in this job I'm doing now. So of course we are getting that influence with government, but the key thing is really working out exactly where the power lays and sits. You may get on to some of that in your further questioning. So at the moment we're talking with not just ourselves, we've got a lot of friends. We need those friends, whether they're in the construction industry, the engineering, the architects, the surveyors. I'm speaking with them all very, very regularly, and they genuinely are our friends, because I think, as one of you just alluded to, in the middle of a global pandemic, possibly heading towards a hard Brexit, is this the right time for a major, major change? Or do we need to get behind the system, the world-class system that we have in place now, and really work together to make that work? And I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but I know what developers are telling me, and it's probably not that different to what you're hearing.
Absolutely. And can we draw the inference from what you've just said, that basically the fundamental starting point of the RTPI is protectionist? Protectionist is probably the wrong word, but supportive of the existing system. Is there a concern and a skepticism about the more radical philosophies of zoning that might get traction with the government?
Well, I think that the interesting thing with zoning is it's one of these words that sort of gained a lot of traction over the last few weeks, in a way. You know, for example, at the start of the year, nobody really knew what social distancing was. They do now. At the start of the year, nobody really knew what zoning was, and actually they still don't, because there is no one single thing as zoning. I think we just want to make that very clear. There are various shades of zones. So, you know, what are we talking about here? And until we have some tangible sort of proposals, it's very hard to comment on the detail. However, I will say this. You can call it what you want. You can call it a major overhaul. You can call it zoning. You can give it another name. Quite frankly, we don't care what you call it, but there are 4 red lines that we've got in relation to this, and they go as this. Number 1, infrastructure. So if you're going to knock things down, build new things, go up, go higher, whatever it is, that development has to play a proportionate role in delivering for infrastructure, whatever that may be in that circumstance. Number 2 is design. Now, of course, that can be addressed with design codes, but we've seen all too often a quick fix development with some interesting design. And there's a nice film circulating at the moment on YouTube, which has been put together with ourselves on the developer, and it features Harlow. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, just have a look at that. Number 3 is consultation and community. And that really is a big red line for us, because if you're not involving the community in a conversation about zoning or whatever you want to call it, then that's just not going to wash, particularly at this moment in time. And the final one, number 4, really, really important, is that commitment to climate action and achieving net zero. So if you can come up with a new system, you can call it zoning, you could give it another name, but whatever that system is, if it delivers on infrastructure, if it delivers fantastic design, if it is engaging with the communities, and you can take communities with you, and it delivers on net zero, then we're all up for a conversation on it. What we are saying though is, and I just said it before, is, you know, major change at this particular moment in time. Is this going to be a helpful thing, or is it going to sort of slow things down a bit? And obviously the jury's out on that until we see the detail. But if zoning means silos, then we're not really sure how that's going to help to join the dots across some really, really complex areas of policy that are playing out now daily. Health inequalities, the quality of homes, the access to infrastructure, how we're all going to be working, living in the future. And that's before you even get started on culture and leisure and amenity. And, you know, we've always said strategic planning is really important at joining those dots. So we're not anti reform and change, but let's have a clear idea about where we want to go with all of that.
Thank you. Now, finally from me, and then I'll ask the various other panelists, finally for me, you obviously on a daily basis meet your younger members. Are you enthusiastic and optimistic about the people and the calibre of those that are coming into the profession?
Well, yes, that is one thing. That is a real shining light out of all of this. If we just take our apprenticeship, we launched the Chartered Town Planner Apprenticeship last year, level 7, thought we might get a few students through, 8 universities, 180 students in year 1. Fantastic opportunities, not only bring in people who never thought about career in planning, but also broaden that diversity. 70 of those 180 alone are at London South Bank University, one of the most diverse universities in the country, if not London. So what a great opportunity. But when, you know, when I'm declaring interest here, I'll show my age. Back in the year 2000, I was chair of the Young Planners Panel, as it was then, and there was 5 of us, and we used to organise a conference. Fast forward 20 years, I've got 9 young planners networks in the regions and 4 in the nations, and they are absolutely alive with enthusiasm and passion. And anybody who thinks chartership is dead needs to go and speak to the young cohort, because they care so passionately about their careers, that they want a professional qualification. They want that network, and they want those professional standards more now than perhaps for many years. And so I'm really enthused about the future cohort coming through. What we must do, to all those listening in, do not keep your apprentices on furlough for a minute longer than you need to, please. Just think about the long-term picture there. Do not let them walk out now, because we've all worked so hard in your graduate schemes, your apprenticeship schemes, etc. Just like hold tight, keep them on board, because we are going to need them when the government's exactly clear on how we're going to use them. We're going to need more planners, I'm quite sure of that. So yeah, the future's really, really bright. And at some point in the future, maybe you'll have our Young Planner of the Year on this show. I think that would be great.
Absolutely. Right. Well, absolutely. Well, Paul, can I ask you? You're on mute, Paul. So can I ask you to ask your question for Victoria, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Sasha. And I should say, just following on from what you've just said, Victoria, my eldest son, I've got 3 boys, my eldest son is going into a career in planning, which is probably a warning rather than necessarily an encouragement. So keep an eye out for him. Okay, my question's got a bit of a run up to the wicket, to use one of Sasha's metaphors. My experience the last 30 years is that every time we get piecemeal reform in the system, introduced by yet another Secretary of State, supposedly to make the system more efficient, the system actually gets more complex and unwieldy. When I started, Robert Carnworth, who then became Lord Carnworth in the Supreme Court, one of the best planning judges we've ever had, was commissioned to hold a royal commission onto enforcement in planning. And he reported, and it became the 1991 Act, which amended the 1990 Act. And by and large, enforcement's been pretty stable over the 30 years of my career. It's been pretty good. So my question is there a case to elevate planning reform beyond policy advisors, beyond politics, and reform by good ideas, and to convene a proper planning reform commission, take evidence, make sober, well-thought-out recommendations, and provide changes to legislation? And my volunteer will be to call it the Katkowski Commission.
It's a really interesting question, that, isn't it? Because we've been thinking about this commission that we understand has been convened, and it's on the record, it's on Hansard, so we know it exists. And to answer that question, I think in thinking about the commission that's there already, what is that trying to do? Well, it's trying to look to the future, look for reforms, look at what we might change. And you have to look at, my starting point is who's part of that conversation? Who is on that commission? And what I'm seeing, but I'm happy to be corrected on this if I've missed it, but I do think the majority of the people who are on that commission are probably aged over 50. They're probably white. They probably own a home and they've probably got a job. But I'm happy to be, I did say the majority, but I'm happy to be, shot down in flames on that. But I think the time now, particularly off the back of this pandemic, is to have some real fresh thinking into what we need to do with planning. And there's ever so slightly a whiff of the 1980s and 90s coming out of some of the rhetoric of that commission. Now, I'm not saying some of their views are wrong. Everyone's entitled to their views. What I am saying is you need to broaden the conversation. And to do that, you've really got to have a greater diversity. So I think there's an opportunity here to have a commission that is representative of the people that we need to help, the people that we're planning for. I lay on the table, you can draw your own conclusions. Is that commission really going to do the job? I don't know. I'd love to be invited to join it, by the way, but I haven't been yet. I doubt I ever will be now. But perhaps these are the sorts of things we need to think about, Paul. So, yeah, let's have a commission, but let's make sure the right people around the table to have the conversation. And I'm not sure if they are. And that's no direct criticism to any of those individuals, many of who I know personally. I'm just saying we might need to broaden it out a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Mary, what would you like to ask Victoria?
I want to ask a question about local plans, Victoria. You've mentioned several times now infrastructure, and I don't wish to sound a defeatist note when you have quite rightly identified how successful planning in this country is seen, particularly from overseas. But does the RTPI think that really the local plan system is working and operating successfully, and how could government in particular help on the infrastructure delivery which is required to underpin these local plans, some of which are failing?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I'm a big fan of infrastructure, so much so for some unknown reason the Institute of Civil Engineers made me a fellow, but I do love a bit of infrastructure because, let's face it, nothing happens without it. In fact, I started in my career in transport planning because I was fascinated on these sorts of issues. What we've been saying at the Royal Town Planning Institute is obviously the local plan is a very important. Having a strong local plan in place is absolutely a prerequisite to providing that certainty. But in our earlier 5 reforms for planning, which we published, I think, back in May now, one of the things we put in there was the need for much more strategic level planning, whether it be at city region, citywide, sub-regional level. And the exact reason we've made that request to government, you've hit the nail on the head, is when you're looking at small and large development, often infrastructure stretches much beyond boundaries. You need to take a far more strategic approach to that. So we think strong local plans, absolutely essential, but you do need to have that strategic level approach that goes beyond just a district council boundary, for example. Otherwise, things get caught into the too difficult box and nothing much sort of happens. I'm exaggerating a bit here, probably for speed. So our view is, we would like to see some sort of strong return to strategic level planning that enables that integration with land use and infrastructure. And that will enable the investment, that we're seeing funneled through. Homes England's done a lot through the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which is a really important part of the jigsaw puzzle, but it all needs to be linked in with land use planning. So that would be our position.
Thank you.
Right, then Charlie, what question would you like to ask Victoria?
Thanks, Sasha. Victoria, what would in your view, the resource implications for planners be of a new system of zoning in the UK if that's implemented? And I say in brackets, I recognise part of the difficulty in that question is what Paul's referred to as the massive uncertainty as to what the government actually has in mind, because as you said, there's all sorts of different permutations of zoning. But so far as you can do, what's this actually going to mean on a day-to-day level for local authorities, for consultancies, etc.?
Well, I think it's Christmas come early, isn't it? Because there's a lot of work going to be involved in this for everybody. I mean, you know, if we're going to start to work out a new zoning system, there's the interpretation of what that means at the local level. Then there's a whole heap of consultation to be done with communities, landowners, all the rest of it. Because, of course, this idea that zoning is a very quick thing, it could be a very quick thing, but you've still got to have some engagement sort of upstream, if you like. So that's got to happen. I think to not to do that engagement would be a bit of a democratic deficit, and perhaps disenfranchise communities even further perhaps than they have been from planning. And then, you know, there's a lot of work to be done to get those zones right, because, I mean, depending on your interpretation of what you mean by zoning, thing with zoning is that certainty is, you know, when it's zoned, it is locked down. End of conversation, doesn't change again. Obviously, the beauty of the UK planning system is there is flexibility there. There's opportunities to be agile, to pivot with the economy, etc. But when you lock down a zone, it doesn't change. Okay, so that is you've got to make sure you get it right, and that does require quite a bit of work. And there may be some objections on the way from people. So I would imagine it may keep the legal profession quite busy for a few years, which no doubt is, pardon the pun, good news. You wanted some good news for you. That could be some good news for you. Yes, but, you know, so I think one of the things we've been talking about at the Royal Town Planning Institute for Resources, digitisation of planning, fantastic opportunity off the back of this pandemic, the way we've been doing things, to do things smarter and better. Yeah. And, you know, if you can digitise some of the back office stuff so that you can free up planners to do some of the more strategic things, fantastic. I cannot see how introducing zoning is going to suddenly reduce a need for people to do things, because you still got to have conversations, you still got to consult, you still got to, you know, it's just a different way of packaging it up. So, but in the short term, I could see there might be a few problems, few challenges, and perhaps one of the biggest challenges is, how do you genuinely engage a conversation with the community about something that isn't happening now, but is a zone that's locked down for something that might happen in a few years' time. And it would be interesting to see, you know, that detail. We just don't know at the moment what zoning is the government has in mind. We just know what we read in the newspapers, like yourself. So interesting. I think we're just going to need more professionally qualified planners to help deliver this green recovery in different ways, and but you know, that would be my take on it, but it's a bit unknown at the moment.
Okay, well, that's really, I mean, that's an incredibly strong set of answers, Victoria. Thank you so much. Chris, in the interest of time, is going to forego his question because he's a superstar, and also his bed awaits after an all-nighter. Can I just say, I just wanted briefly, Charlie, before I hand back to you, can I just very briefly say, in the context of the champion of the week, I just wanted to raise, just to let Chris lose his bet 6 weeks in a row, could everyone please look at the Select Committee's letter to the Secretary of State on the West Ferry case, only because there's some really important points of principle raised in that letter that they want answered on how the Secretary of State should operate the planning system. So my champ of the week are the members of the House Housing Select Committee, and this is such a great manifestation of the important role those select committees play.
Thanks, Sasha. Well, nudge of the week from me. Well, I'm going to sell slightly close to Rind, but hope for the right side 9, and I'm going to nudge a judge. As we know, Mrs. Justice Leven, Natalie Leven QC, as she previously was, gave judgment allowing a challenge by the Airborough local residents group to the Leeds site allocations plan relating to greenbelt releases. There's been a second round of argument since then about what remedy the court should grant as a result. Should they remit the plan? Should they quash it? Should it be the Airborough only policy? Should it be the full greenbelt? I'm not going to go into detail of the arguments because we'll cover it once she gives her judgment. But they're of huge practical importance across Leeds, where there's some quite important development interests, political importance for local residents, and also legal importance for other plans. Judicial term ends at the end of this month. It would be really helpful for everybody if we could get the judgment before then, rather than having to wait till the judges get back in October. So that is my very, very polite nudge of the judge.
You're very brave, Charlie. Very brave.
The week ahead.
In terms of relief, has anyone asked for her to guarantee Leeds go into the Premiership and don't blow their 7th promotion campaign in a row?
Watching.
Just because your team won this week.
What's coming up, Mary, next week ahead?
Why does planning always come back to football? Every good regeneration scheme needs a stadium, apparently. I just don't get it.
No, it doesn't.
Right. Completely right. So, Charlie, what do we now tell us before we go? Mary, what's next week? What are we doing?
Well, next week we're improving our diversity. We have Charlotte Morfitt. Not only is she a woman, but she is young by our standards, by Anna's standards. So about women in planning, and if you're very lucky, you might be able to talk about the judgment of Mrs. Justice Leavin.
You never know. Thanks, Mary. And also, between now and next week, we'll be able to have haircuts, unless you're Chris and a refusenik on that regard. We're going to go for dinner. I've got my dinner booked at the Hard Rock Cafe in Piccadilly because I'm such a classy guy on Saturday night. I can't wait. I've even got the hair for it.
When are we going to tell Charlie? When are we going to tell you Hard Rock went passé in about 1983?
That's the best year that ever was, though. Did time stop in 1983, Sasha? You should know that. We'll see you all next week. I hope.
Hold on, Charlie. Charlie, we need to say one last thing. Forgive me.
Yes.
Happy birthday, Victoria.
Absolutely. Very, very well, man.
Can I do this now?
All you need is a straw, Victoria. Happy birthday. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. It's been a real privilege. And you're Newt, fully licensed or exempted. We're really looking forward to speaking with Charlotte next week. I hope that I'll still be here. So I'm on baby watch at the moment, but the date is meant to be the 16th. So fingers crossed I'll be here for the next 2 weeks. Please don't forget the donations to the NHS, Clap for Our Carers, or a local charity of your choice. Have a great weekend and a lovely evening tonight, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again.
Cheers.
Thank you.